Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's EFN Trauma webinar. Those of you will have seen that we, from the Trauma Working Group, have decided to hand the session over this evening to Dr. Leah Edwards, who's going to be talking to us specifically about human trafficking situation in relation to what's going on in Ukraine. So it's sure to be a very interesting topic. So I think most of you, or many of you, will know of or know in person Dr. Leah Edwards. She is a member of the EFN operations team. She's worked in the humanitarian sector, in and around the humanitarian sector for a very long time. I think once we worked out that we were both in Haiti at the same time, but we never actually met each other. And she is, of course, a researcher. So so the format for this evening is that I'm going to hand over to Leah very shortly to do her presentation. I think she may open us in prayer as well, and then as she's going through the topics, we have a number of different translations going on. So we have Polish, Slovak, Romanian and Hungarian, and I'm sure you're all super familiar with Zoom by now, but the translations, the interpretations are at the bottom of your screen. If you need them, you can just click on the language that you want. So Leah will do her presentation. Please, as she's going, do pop questions into the chat and or into the Q&A. If someone's already if you use the Q&A, if someone's put in the Q&A a question you want to ask, you can vote for it and it puts it further up, so I'm more likely to see it. But when Leah's finished presenting, I will then take her through your questions on your behalf. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Leah. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And yes, I will open us up in a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to come together, to learn, to share. And Lord, I just ask that you bring this war and this conflict to an end, and that you bring peace, and that we may see your goodness in the land of the living. So thank you for this time, and I pray that it is fruitful to all that are listening and that are here in attendance. Amen. Right, I'm going to share my screen, and then we're going to get going. So welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I have been keeping up on the various webinars that have been happening, and it is exciting to join you and to lead you through this topic today. Today, we're going to be diving into what does human trafficking look like in the context of the Ukrainian refugee crisis. In case anyone is here or listening to this later that is not familiar with EFN, we are a Christian faith-based network of over 260 anti-trafficking organizations. And we are responding from all of the countries bordering Ukraine for this crisis. I should also note that this presentation was not solely written by myself. I've had many amazing inputs from Leah Edwards, our executive director, the team at eLiberare in Romania, and the Lighthouse Foundation in Poland. So thank you for all of those that have contributed to this presentation. So it has been a painful, destabilizing 80 days. I never know what I'm going to wake up to when I see the news. I was on a train coming back from meeting with some EFN partners in Germany when the war broke out. And the person sitting across the carriage from me, of course, you get talking on a train, learned that I was a sociologist. And I describe being a sociologist as someone who is interested in all of the weird and wonderful parts of what makes us human. And their question to me was, well, what do you think about what's happening now? Boy, has my answer shifted and changed and grown over the past 80 days about what we are seeing. In the human trafficking arena, this has been one of the first conflicts where this has been on the agenda from the forefront. We have seen so many different organizations, churches, Christian groups, volunteers gathering together to attempt to do the best that they can do to keep refugees safe, in all forms of protection and specifically on human trafficking. So some of you who are listening today may have been involved in driving to the border, for doing transportation, for gathering physical aid. The picture here is of the church that I attend in the Netherlands, and they're continually driving aid to fellow churches in parts of Poland. The middle picture is a copy of some of the initial top tips that our EFN members and partners with the operations team put together to hopefully share out as much as possible. So it has been a busy 80 days. It has been traumatizing. We have heard and we've seen all sorts of stories of men standing with cardboard signs with Milan or Berlin on them and taking people, and we don't know where they've gone. We've seen chaotic borders. We've seen borders that have gained structure. We've also seen a huge response from average, ordinary people who want to help. We've also seen that honeymoon end. And there's a question of, how is this response sustainable? So I kind of paint this picture just to say that we are kind of in a very unstable place. We don't know what is going to happen in the East. We don't know the fate and the longevity of this conflict. And we don't know how it is going to transpire for those that have left, that are now living in Western Europe or further abroad. So with that, let's put on our trafficking glasses so we can see this through the lens of trafficking, so that we could understand potentially the potential risks that individuals are facing. Now, I'm attempting to speak slowly in respect to the translation, so I'm just going to give a brief pause to make sure that everybody can get caught up before we continue. In any conversation of trafficking, we have to start with the definition. There are a lot of assumptions about trafficking. There are a lot of questions about what it is in comparison to other human rights violations. The text on this screen is the opening parts of the Palermo Protocol, which was drafted by the United Nations in 2000 in an attempt to bring the various definitions that were forming around the world into one central location. These are the types of trafficking that we are speaking about today and that we are concerned for all sorts of vulnerable populations. In review, that would be the exploitation of those for forced prostitution and for sexual exploitation, for forced labor and services, for slavery or similar practices to slavery, like servanthood, or the removal of organs. This is a bit of a messy chart because trafficking is messy. Trafficking is a process. It is not one exact person trafficking one exact other person in one exact moment. It is a lot of small decisions that happen over time with many different actors or people involved. But in all of that complexity that real life brings, in all of its rich pain, we have to understand that all of these things could be present. This is part of the challenge of definitions on paper versus the lived experience. And it's good to sit with this and to look at it. Many conversations around trafficking have been so focused on sexual exploitation that the conversations have left behind considerations of forced labor or the illegal harvest of organs. And many people think of a trafficker as a certain stereotype of a type of person, but actually many different people can be involved in the trafficking process, and many different types of acts and means can be used in that process. So trafficking happens over time, and it's also complex. Now, we're going to start to kind of go from the general and go into what we're looking at in Ukraine. Ukraine has been a country that has been known to have challenges and issues with trafficking and exploitation for quite a long time. There is an established anti-trafficking response, grassroots organizations, government organizations that have been working on this issue for a long time. The data on this chart here shows some of the regions where previous to the conflict, it was known that Ukrainians were trafficked to. And as you can see, various parts of Europe, as well as the Middle East and South Asia. East Asia. You see the total number there of 2,437 individuals. That is seemingly a very low number in some respects, and is not necessarily a representative number. It is so important to remember that in the anti-trafficking sector, data is so hard to have. It is so hard to find, and there is a huge issue with underreporting. But I do put this here to specifically note that there are many refugees that have experienced trafficking, whether they have ever disclosed that to someone, or they would even consider themselves to be survivors of trafficking, is a different conversation. But it is worth noting, as this group has spent a lot of time considering trauma and its effects, something that is going to be affecting the refugee population. So moving forward, as we have been considering and watching how the situation has transpired, the first few waves of refugees were individuals with some sort of power and availability of means, money, their own vehicle, friends or family to stay in another country. They had plans potentially put in place. As this conflict continues, every wave of refugees that leaves has less and less power to protect themselves and to keep those they're traveling with safe. That could be because they are being evacuated by the ICRC or by another aid group through a humanitarian corridor. It could be that they don't have their own transportation, or they don't have any other friends or relatives in another country that they could go to. And also that they have been living in potentially, if we're considering the largest numbers of individuals that are displaced out of their homes in Ukraine right now, are in a rural area, then those individuals are going to have had experienced the last 80 days of war. Now, this bullet point is a tricky one. We all are here to help. We all are here because we feel like, whether it's because of our faith and our personal experience with Christianity, or whether it's because of our understanding of social and moral justice, that we want to see change, that we want to do good, that we want to help people. In the process of helping, there is the potential, and unfortunately it does happen, where harm can be done. Whether we realize it or not, helpers have power. Power meaning you have the power to provide someone a service or something that they're in need of, or the assistance to another person who can provide them something. And in those situations, if they're not managed well, if there's not proper training, and if there's not the understanding of the value of another person, corruption and abuse can be found. So in all of this, and I'm sure you've already talked about it in some of your other trainings in terms of the importance of self-care and avoiding burnout to avoid being susceptible to things like this, we must understand that even if our good intentions are there, they are not necessarily going to prevent harm from happening. So I would like to now look at the first part of this slide on the top would be the types of trafficking that are vulnerable to women. Forced prostitution would be the first and foremost. I was on a call today with some individuals who collected data from the east of Ukraine, and there were stories of women who felt like they had no other choice except to be allowed or chose. Again, this language is very, doesn't always match the situations. And they, for transportation to leave the country. with their children, and they ended then up into prostitution. There are many different types of prostitution frameworks across Europe, and a lot of them, it is very easy for someone to be inserted, though they are a trafficked victim, being inserted into a legal prostitution system. With the rise of COVID-19 and the demand for more online sexual materials, forced online sexual exploitation is becoming more and more of a problem. Also for women with children, there is the push that this is a safer job to get into because you're not in physical contact with buyers, and you could do it from the safety of your home. But as we all know, the situations that can transpire from those things can lead very quickly to exploitation. Labor exploitation is also needing to be mentioned. Many women, and I'm saying women mostly because the majority of the refugee population is women and children, would be that of domestic servitude. Again, similar types of tactics by traffickers to say, hey, you can come stay with me, clean my house, maybe take care of my children. Or we'll connect you to those kinds of jobs or job advertisements for cleaning work. And the cleaning sector is already a very vulnerable sector for exploitation to happen. And it is also something where individuals in Ukraine might have been used to being paid the equivalent of a 1 or 2 British pounds per hour. Sorry, my currencies aren't working in my head. But so being paid £3 an hour seems like a lot, but actually by European standards, that is exploitation. So there's a lot of slippery slope for things to happen. And when someone is desperate and in needing something, they're maybe not considering these kinds of risks. Other vulnerable groups to consider in this is individuals who may experience forced surrogacy. This is a complicated topic, and I only feel like I need to mention it very briefly, as it's not the overall purpose of the presentation. But there was a surrogacy industry in Ukraine prior to the war, and there has been a known trend of traffickers using forced pregnancy for the eventual sale of babies in the broader region. Excuse me while I mute myself because I need to cough. It should also be noted that, excuse me, any member of the LGBTQ community, particularly transgender women, are a particular risk and concern for their vulnerabilities as they are social minorities in many countries. And then also lastly, anyone, as I previously mentioned, who has experienced gender-based violence or human trafficking previously is at risk for being trafficked. Okay. I'm going to pause now for interpretation as I've been asked to, and then you can start to read, the indicators. So these indicators are, excuse me, I need to go back one slide. Sorry about that. Okay, here we are. These indicators are things that I would highly suggest that you read back over following the presentation. We will be sending out the presentation in PDF form. These are things that when you're attempting to understand how trafficking is happening, that you need to be considering. Trafficking happens in front of us. It is not something that happens in distant, faraway places. It is something that is worked into everyday life. So it takes learning to understand what you're seeing. These Indicators are also things to consider, particularly for this conflict, but also in general. There are nuances and changes that can be seen based on the situation. I won't read over them mainly for translation purposes, but please take time to review them. And it is usually these indicators are used in multiples. So if it's just someone traveling alone, that may or may not be safe. But considering if there are other indicators present is when question and concern can be raised. Some specific indicators for considering minors. And I say minors specifically as with this conflict, there are a large number of minors traveling by themselves. And as I say that, I realized that I have missed a slide. Excuse me while I go back to this slide. I'm going to pause for translation. Okay, excuse me for missing this slide. So these are other types of trafficking that may be experienced by individuals that are not women. I originally attempted to cover types of trafficking in vulnerable groups. For women, men currently are mostly fighting and still within the country. Some men are either able to leave legally or via corruption. But previous to the conflict, Ukrainian men were known to be exploited in construction and agriculture and mining in neighboring countries. As I was saying previously on the indicator slide about unaccompanied children, there is a huge history of large numbers of children being in institutions, orphanages, group care. And these children may or may not have been through quite a number of traumatizing experiences and are being moved across borders with very little identification and at further risk for being trafficked for sexual exploitation and for organ trafficking and harvesting, or simply for the sale of a child. There's many reports of many children being let across borders with very little to no documentation. So there is a huge concern about the number of simply missing children. Minority communities, as that of the Roma, are of particular concern as they are categorically being denied services and shelter and accommodation. This is, for many of you who've worked with that community, a longstanding issue and a longstanding situation of racism. Ukrainians who are forcibly or with very little choice returned or choose to go to Russia, especially from the East, are in particularly vulnerable situations as the Russian government and Russian crime syndicates are well-known traffickers. And third country nationals, individuals who are not members of the European Union and living in Europe, and particularly individuals who were being exploited prior to the conflict, who are third country nationals. We heard a lot of stories around university students who were stuck and were eventually evacuated or attempted to get options, but this is still a community of concern. I'm going to switch back to the indicator slide and take a pause for translation. All right, going back to minors. Individuals who are posing as siblings that might have no resemblance of each other, individuals who are children, who are traveling with people other than family members, and any kind of sign of physical and emotional neglect. These are all things to be considering. I have unfortunately been listening to cases and working with some of EFN members on how to support organizations through this process. And in many countries in surrounding Ukraine, there are challenges in the foster care system or in the child welfare protection system. So if your organization is getting anywhere near attempting to help children, this is an area of great sensitivity and concern. So how do traffickers work? I put that photo there that is from Stop the Traffic, and apologies that the credit is not put below that photo. That's my mistake. As I loved it because it breaks down every stereotype that you might have based off of your culture, the media you take in about who a trafficker is and what they look like. But in many cases, a trafficker will attempt to appear to solve a problem and to be some form of a helper and to create some form of trust. Usually I present outside of a wartime context, and I say that it's usually somebody that someone has a relationship with, a distant friend, a family member. Because of the type of conflict and we're seeing with a refugee crisis and refugee movement, there are strangers attempting to provide assistance. Over time, as individuals settle and or build relationships with people, that risk of someone that is known to them facilitating a form of trafficking also is present. I've mentioned a few of these examples before, but cash for work is something that is being used quite a lot to attempt to help refugees across the current response. Humanitarian organizations are doing it, as well as individuals who are attempting to exploit others. So individuals could be offering jobs for quick money, but yet once those jobs happen, they could be ending up withholding pay, jobs with no contracts or low wage. And all of these types of jobs could be seen on social media for fake job adverts. There's been many reports from all over Western Europe of Facebook, Telegram, various other messaging services where these can be found. There's a lot more that we can go into here. Maybe we can save that for the question and answer time. I think I've covered some of this already, but traffickers are going to be in places where people are needing to make decisions and where they're feeling vulnerable. We're hearing reports of secondary borders being used. A secondary border in this case would be between, let's say, Moldova and Romania, rather than the Moldovan and Ukraine border. As I've said, there's been a high spotlight on trafficking. So many of the borders in the main border crossings have attempted to have a concern for trafficking. But there are many other types of border areas where things are still unstable. In areas where active evacuation efforts are attempting to be had and where individuals need to leave quickly, where they need to be using other people's transportation, these are areas where traffickers can be operating. Social media is a huge landmine of different opportunities and vulnerabilities for traffickers to operate, and forms of accommodation and refugee centers. Staying in a refugee center is not cozy. It's not comfortable. And the longer that individuals have to be there or feel like they have no other choice, as they maybe have thought that they could have gone home by now, home being defined either as Ukraine or as their particular place of residence, there are more challenges and vulnerabilities that traffickers can exploit with attempting to solve housing and accommodation and job problems. And time. Just because one trafficking risk was mitigated or stopped, it doesn't mean that that won't happen again. And the longer this conflict draws out, the longer that people are away from their social networks, people that they trust, when money runs out, all times where these things can happen. And I am within the last 10 minutes of my presentation, so I'm going to try to kind of bring this together so we can have hopefully a robust question and answer time. So before your church, your action group, any form of why you're here wanting to learn more about this today begins attempting to identify survivors, please take a long time to really consider the implications of what you could be doing. The worst thing you could do is attempt to provide protection and shelter for a potential victim without having a plan of how to meaningfully and safely help that person with the use of trained NGOs and the police force. Once someone has been offered help and assistance, if that is not something you're actually able to provide, greater harm can be done. So take time to consider the information that you're learning from this presentation, from potentially all of the sources where you're pulling information before your church, your organization decides to do something. And it should be known that throughout the countries of Europe, there are many different forms of support mechanisms for survivors. So really take time to learn where you are, especially if you're not a native of that country or you haven't worked in the trafficking space before there. So the call to action for your church, your community of faith, is to really think of training, partnerships, purchasing, and reporting. I have a slide for each, so we'll dive into them. You've sat through me listening, lovely. I wish I could see your faces for the past 30 minutes. There'll be more trainings to come. And unfortunately, trafficking is always changing. This information, this presentation has already changed multiple times since I wrote it a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, there is always going to be more learning. Please keep an eye on our website, our social media, our newsletters. Our website has all of that information. Follow it there and reach out to us. We are here to help you on the operations team and we're with the EFN. And the operations team and the amazing networks and members of the EFN have already done a lot. There's a lot of information on our website, specifically for churches. EFN, really, when you boil us down to the very bottom of the pot, we are here to support Christians with a faith-based understanding of human trafficking. So when you need information to help speak about these things in your churches, within your community of faith, our website has heaps of materials, and a lot of them have been produced by the trauma working group that is hosting this seminar. So thank you. And as you can see there by all the flags, they're in a lot of different languages. If you have more needs, please be in touch with us or with Kara. Now, reporting. Reporting sometimes can feel scary. Reporting sometimes can feel intense. But it is very important that we report our information to the police and or the national referral mechanisms. There are a lot of questions and concerns about sometimes reporting to the police, because depending on where you are, the police may not be trained in anti-trafficking responses, and they may lack trauma-informed interviewing techniques when working with survivors. It is important to note that if for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable to report to the police, even though that is the best and first place to go, the national referral mechanisms or referral pathways that every country has, and again, it looks a little different in each country, is the next best place. The individuals and the organizations that run these structures are trained specifically to work with vulnerable persons and survivors of trafficking. And they commonly have, they most always have methods of providing immediate protection if the situation requires it. And kind of the slogan or the saying that we're trying to create is that if you see something, report it and note it. As I've already said, trafficking, this whole field is so lacking in data and so lacking in information that keeping a track of what you're doing, keeping track of what you're seeing is very important. I mentioned the national referral mechanisms. The logos here are from the Polish Kciuk, I hope I said that right, and from Oh, I forget how to say the one in Romanian. I was just in Bucharest. Antepa, maybe? I'm so sorry, translators. So both of these just are examples of the national referral mechanisms in two countries where you may be working or maybe from. But generally speaking, these are the types of services that any form of national referral pathway should be offering. It's not hard to find these documents based off of the country that you're in. If you have trouble finding them or need more assistance, please feel free to reach out to me and I can help. Now, there are many things that if you are operating in a border area or in a refugee center or just in a general normal everyday life, you might see something that you think, hey, I think there's something going on here that's related to trafficking and exploitation, but I don't know what to do about it because I don't know if anybody is in immediate danger. I don't have enough information to report to the police, but I still feel like something is wrong. That's where we have something called the Stop app. The Stop app is an application that has been put together by Stop the Traffic, which is a UK-based charity that is working to have an easy, anonymous way for everyday individuals, as well as survivors of trafficking who feel like they can't even go to the police, report their stories. It's very clear that this is not an alert app. While actual data analysts do look at the data, if something is immediately happening, the police and the national referral mechanism is who you should call. But when you're seeing suspicious trends, when you're seeing things that you don't quite know what to do with or don't have all of the pieces for, this is a really great option to help provide the anti-trafficking community with more data. There's a lot to be said about the app, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to kind of go a little bit quickly over it. But you can download it and start using it very simply and quickly. It doesn't keep anything on your phone, and it's connected to a broader data analysis hub where that information can be seen and understood. I unfortunately don't have enough time to go further into this. If this is something you'd like to learn more about, please contact me and I'd be happy to set up another call with you. And or also refer you to Stop the Traffic. Please go to their website and they have a ton of information there. So see it, report it, and note it. Thank you so much for being with us today. I eagerly await your questions. I hope I have spoken slow enough, and I would be happy to spend the next, I think, almost 15 to 20 minutes to go through the questions you may have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so we can have a bit more of a nicer screen to look at. Kara, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was excellent. I will just mention to everyone, in case they haven't seen it in the chat, that Peter Mills from the Traffic Analysis Hub, which is the intelligence arm of Stop the Traffic, has popped his details into the chat if people want to directly talk to him about the app. And I think, so thank you. That was a fabulous presentation. Now, I think you gave us so much information that we don't have many questions in the chat. However, I have a whole load of questions for you. So,
come on.
So while I'm asking these questions, please feel free, those who are watching, to pop other questions into the chat or comments or things that come up from what we're talking about. So, okay, so I think one of my questions is, and it was early on, there were sort of identified risks and situations at some of the key transit points. I think there was a particular example of one of the big German railway hubs where trafficking was that was seen and was being done. Do we think is that still happening? Is that still a big risk? I know the numbers are slightly less now of people moving.
Yeah, this conflict is proving to be different than many conflicts in the sense of people are already returning back. So in the humanitarian situations where I have worked before, people fled Syria, they moved to Jordan, they went to a tented refugee camp that was built by UNHCR, and they have been living there ever since. There, have been some people that kind of either leave the camp to come back, but they're not leaving to go back necessarily to Syria. That is just kind of, for example's sake, to compare it to the fact that there have already been millions of people that have returned to Ukraine, even though there's still active fighting, even happening in Lviv or in the further western region, at least bombardment. So I think any sort of transit point is going to be a vulnerable place for the foreseeable future. I agree that in the beginning, like the images of the Warsaw train station and in Budapest, there was a lot of those kind of shocking images of pounds of people and just folks not having anywhere to go. With just being in Warsaw a couple of weeks ago, the train station, you wouldn't really notice that there was anything going on, except, oh yeah, there are a few white tents around the back and a few people in a high-vis vest. So I think that it's good to continue to be vigilant, to be monitoring, and to continue to train anyone who's working in the situations, because a lot of these emergency responders transition very quickly. Large international organizations or even national organizations transition their staff within every couple of weeks. So just because you did a training, because we were there a month ago, there's a lot of those people actually leaving to go back to other parts of the world. Some folks are now being established to work in Polish teams working in Poland for the foreseeable future. So yeah.
Okay. And then a question from the chat. So someone was they've been asking, do you have, I think you mentioned the secondary border of Moldova to Romania, I think. My geography is really bad, so I apologize. But they were saying, are there any examples of other secondary borders that you're aware of?
It was mostly the conversations I'm pulling from are in those border regions between Hungary and Romania and Moldova. So anywhere where there's a border between two countries that also shares a border with Ukraine, but not the Ukraine border. Right. Sorry, I feel like I should show a map. But I think those are less policed. Those have less focus on the conflict. They're potentially more porous areas, particularly at night. And it is just generally easier for individuals to take advantage of others, whether it's overcharging taxi rides, something as simple as that, to more challenging things. Because this is being recorded, I don't want to go into like super great detail of some of the information that I've heard just for the longevity of recordings, but I think that's enough to say that that individuals are continually at risk no matter what border they're on in the process of moving out.
And I think there was a question as well from the chat about basically from so do you think Ukrainian women have been more vulnerable in this conflict due to men not being able to leave Ukraine? Is it common that men are not able to leave conflict zones?
I'm not a specialist on the martial law of Ukraine, but I know that there are many countries around the world that when conflict arises, that men are conscripted or required for whether that is the martial law of that time or how the national law works of that country, that they are required to stay. Women in Ukraine are and have been vulnerable to gender-based violence for a very, very long time. Women in Ukraine have many challenges in interpersonal violence, in sexual violence, in all forms of gender-based violence, trafficking being one of many. So I think that the presence of men, I don't actually know if that would have helped or not. There was a new research report that I was just reading today of how women feel less safe in public spaces since the onset of the war, and men feel more safe because they have the ability to carry arms, they have the ability to act almost without impunity, if not impunity. So women, and as we've been hearing about the conflict related sexual violence, there are many fears of a matter of when and not if women will be experiencing one, if not some, or if not all forms of gender-based violence.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, from my experiences with back in the sort of the era of the Balkan Wars when I was working in Kosovo, I think this is a very different situation, because there you were looking at massacres of entire groups of people, rather whether male or female. It wasn't a war where a population were fighting back. So it's the first time we've really seen that in Europe, I think, for many years. So here's a question, and if we can't answer these questions now, we will do our best to find out the information for you. But someone's saying, we're starting to see more and more women and girls from Ukraine in the brothel districts in Athens. Are you aware of any organisations, contacts in Ukraine who are working with the restoration of Ukrainian women specifically?
Yes, let's be in touch. I'm not going to, to be very honest, I can't pronounce their names, because as we've just been joking with the translators, my Slavic language competency is not up to speed. And also for safety and security of those organizations as it's being recorded. But Andrew, let's be in touch. And if anyone else needs further contact, please be in touch. There is a robust anti-trafficking grassroots organization space in Ukraine. They are still working. Women are holding up the world there. So definitely want to respect their work and want to champion them as much as possible and connect people as much as possible in that way.
I think perhaps there's an action for us at EFN in terms of updating the website, where we put a lot of information about organisations in the countries on the borders of Ukraine that were supporting trafficking victims, potential trafficking victims. I think there's probably an action for us to update within the Ukraine section as well, which answers actually one of my questions, which I was going to ask about, which was, you made reference to it, but the fact that a large number of people are actually going back in to Ukraine now, and we have this situation where there are such high numbers of internally displaced people. And what we saw, I think, at the beginning of the conflict was that the internal Ukraine organized crime groups kind of stood down to deal with the bigger threat. Is that still happening, or do we know about what's happening in terms of internal trafficking?
Internal trafficking, I would have to come back to you on. I know that with spending some time learning from the Stop the Traffic folks and the intel that they've been receiving, that it took a number of just a few weeks for kind of the the movements of who does what and where and how or different groups. But I think the longer that this goes on, the more likely that the urgent patriotic sense of what is happening will wane, when especially needs are becoming even more scarce. Obviously, it will probably very much depend on where individuals are. And obviously, if you're in the East, very different situation. But I think that is an ongoing concern, as there are drastic amounts of individuals that are, that in English, it's IDP, or internally displaced persons, that are within the country right now.
Okay.
There's something, there's one here that I just popped up that I would like to address. Is that all right? If I
you crack on, yeah.
So in Sweden, the comment reads, in Sweden, Ukrainian women in sexual exploitation have been identified in very limited number. The organizations that I've been sitting with for the last couple of weeks, Ukrainian organizations and international protection organizations that have been working in Ukraine since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, are really expecting there to be a wave of official identifications, or more official identifications, within the coming months, as this is what's happened before. For some of us, this feels like we've already been going on this for a long time, because we've been responding since day one. But for many international organizations, they're just getting their feet started now. So when you're talking to grassroots organizations in Ukraine about what they're seeing in trafficked, they're seeing people trafficked. We haven't yet seen where they're being trafficked to. I am fully anticipating the emails and the texts within the next couple of weeks of whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the Gulf, whether it's in the Mediterranean countries, or here in Western Europe, of individuals starting to be seen. But there is also a knownness about being Ukrainian now in a different way. So whether that will be something that traffickers will want to push down and make women not as visible, there's a lot of questions and concerns. So I guess if we're not seeing it now, it doesn't mean it's not happening. That's, I guess, my caution.
I think that's fair. I mean, the UK government took action on some potential risks relating to women and potentially being at risk of trafficking only just this weekend, just gone. And that it's been going on from our perspective. We've been dealing with this for months, so
years.
They are years as well.
Yeah.
And I also do wonder if because someone's asked, do we know how many cases there are of identified Ukrainians? And I think you've answered that question saying we don't really know yet, it's still early days. But I think one of the challenges we've always had in the anti-trafficking world is and just as one example, that in the UK Albanian trafficking victims will often try to pass as Romanian trafficking victims because they feel that they may get more rights and entitlements, understandably, and makes complete sense to me. But so I wonder how many potentially found victims may try to claim Ukrainian status for a while, as you're looking at survival strategies here. So I think it's going to be a muddy picture for a while, I think.
Correct. And the other thing to remember is there is no good country that has a great way for trafficking victims to say, hi, I've been trafficked. So actually getting to the point where you have an official government recognized acknowledgement of your trafficking status is a hard process. It is a painful process, is a traumatizing process. So when we're talking about the number of officially identified trafficking victims, and this can be said about anywhere in the world, that number will always be very small because of how difficult the process is to actually achieve that status. Most organizations will have this understanding of they are working with individuals. There's a small number of them that are identified, but the most of their clients that they're working with and supporting are not officially identified for a lot of very valid reasons.
Yeah, no, that's great. We have there's been a few extra questions about the app, and I know that you cut short your section talking about the app. So there's a question about where is the data stored and which organization, a question about whether it's useful in the States, or can be used in the States and other parts that aren't Europe. I mean, obviously Peter is on the call, I think, if he's still there, so he may want to pop some answers in the chat, but also I know, Leah, it's something you know a lot about. So did you want to say a little bit more about the app?
Look, let me just find which questions are here and I'll see which ones I can answer, and then I might ask Peter Peter, are you still here?
So one is, where does information entered in the Stop app end up? What agency takes action based on it?
Actually, let me just pull up a slide. I have pretty much ready to go, where I have incorporated this in the presentation before.
I thought you probably would have had the
answer. No, it's not there. The Trafficking Analysis Hub is where the information gets stored, and that was created with Stop the Traffic in consultation with IBM. And I believe the ballpark number of 5 million, I forget if it was pounds or dollars, excuse me, Peter, please clarify me there, was used to create as secure database as possible, where, especially for those reporting, that is as anonymous as possible, and where the data is as safe as possible. I'm not finding the slide fast enough. So what was the other question? If that hopefully helps.
So it was about, is it just for UK and Europe, or is
it
worldwide?
It should be available on all of the app stores.
Right.
And if you go to their website, there is a lot of information about it. It is available on Android and iOS.
Brilliant.
And yeah, you can use it from wherever you are. There are certain languages that it's not in as of yet, but it is definitely in English and also Ukrainian.
Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you. Okay. Just a couple of I think final questions. I'll see what else comes into the hub. Oh, Peter, super helpful. Thank you. The data ends up at the hub. The action is, if action is needed, it will be passed to LEA and the NCA or Interpol, which I don't know what, you might need to type those acronyms in. And the app can be accessed by www.stopthetraffic.org. Yes, I don't know what those acronyms are. LEA and NCA is National Crime Agency, which is UK one. I don't know what LEA is though, so I probably should.
And basically, to clarify, just so if you report something and you never want it to be traced back to you, it never will be. So Stop the Traffic acts as like a firewall. So when they make that report, Interpol, it will come from aggregate data from Stop the Traffic. So it has multiple layers of protection. And Stop the Traffic does a variety of different things depending on what the type of case is, to make sure that everyone stays safe.
Thank you. Okay, so just a couple of questions about resources, actually. I mean, you talked a little bit about supply chains, and one of the things that we could do is to look at our supply chain, making sure we don't have any slavery in our supply chains. Are there any resources that can help us with that as NGOs and churches?
Yeah, it is good to consider all elements of who and what is in your organization. A lot of, let's take the example of a law firm. A law firm can go, I'm not involved in human trafficking. I'm not buying sex. I'm, seemingly there just to keep the lights on and do my job. Upon further review, who is cleaning your law firm? How are those individuals being treated? Who is staffing the canteen or the food service of an office building? We are working on resources to help churches and Christian organizations consider their supply chains, but it takes kind of a moment of reflection. I was sitting with a presentation with Matt Freedom from the Mekong Club, which has an NGO that works with large corporates, and a large organization might go, oh, there was no slavery to make this pencil case because I know the factory and everybody who made this pencil case was treated fairly. But then Matt was like, well, who made the zipper? Who actually made the fabric? Who made the cotton? All of these types of things. So there's many layers to it, but EFN is working a lot on that at the minute. We were actually doing a lot of that before the conflict, and I'm just going to a presentation about supply chains and conflict, so I can share that link.
I'm going to one as well for EFN next week, so yes, so
we're probably at the same one, Carol.
yeah, probably. I think I'm doing the other one. I think you're doing one, I'm doing the other. Anyway, but no, that's really helpful. And I think because the Ukraine situation is terrible. It's happening, and we need to address those issues. But we also need to, I feel quite strongly, we also need to hold a mind to kind of the longer term. And actually, if the markets aren't there, if the market isn't there for sexual exploitation, if the market isn't there for labor exploitation, if everyone is mindful of who is doing their housekeeping and their cleaning, and labor exploitation will then be reduced, then actually these risks will gradually become less and less over time. So I think it's an important thing. So I can't see any more questions coming in the chat, so I'm just going to ask you two more questions, and then if there's anything else you want to say. So one was, are there resources? You're talking about the risks of trafficking. You talked about the indicators of trafficking. Are there resources and stuff around for us to help us inform refugees in our countries about the risks?
Yeah, so I would direct you to the European Freedom Network's website. We have taken quite a lot of time to put a short, sharp, easy materials together. We have heard from refugees that there has been the scary materials. I'm thinking of the English word fear mongering. And so there have been materials, and I've seen them floating around different parts of Europe as I've been traveling, of images that are just not nice to look at, of individuals with their hands being bound, or, sad individuals, or children that look like they're in pain, all while, trying to help you. Yeah, all re-traumatizing. So we all are on our learning journey with how to make good communications materials in this sector, but EFN really, with the help of members and partners, really tried to make materials that were not re-traumatizing, that were clear, that were understandable. So when you go to our website, there's a heap of things that are there geared to communities, and a lot of our members have printed them off in banner form as well as leaflet form, and or shared them digitally. Stop the Traffic also has a heap of materials as well. At this point, anyone responding to the conflict has a heap of materials. I would just highly vet which ones you're using to make sure that any phone numbers are active and correct. I know that EFNs are, for hotlines, for reporting, and to make sure that any of the imagery used on the brochures are not going to cause any sort of fear or concern in anyone that's looking at them.
Great, that's really helpful, and that's such a good tip to check that what you've got is current and accurate. And then my final sort of question for you was, for those of us who aren't on the front line, there's so many churches, so many NGOs working really hard on the front line, be that on the actual borders, on the secondary borders, dealing with managing and finding hosting placements and all sorts of other things. But for those of us not on the front line, do you have any ideas about how we can make a difference in our own countries? What small things we can do as individuals and as churches, and maybe as small NGOs to help make a difference?
There are Ukrainians everywhere. They may or may not have registered at an official refugee status. So be kind to the people that are around you. I noticed the other week walking down my street that a nail salon went from looking like a normal nail salon of just kind of like the average, like just ones I see everywhere in the Netherlands, to now with a Ukrainian flag in the window, stand with Ukraine. We offer types of nail styles that you could get in Ukraine and different things. And I'm like, interesting. All right, there's Ukrainians living in my neighborhood now. Unfortunately, due to being a young mom of two and working a lot for EFN at the minute, I haven't had a chance to get to know them. So that's on my to-do list. But be kind to those that are around you. They might not be presenting as individuals with the most need, but they are still individuals that have had to flee their country because of war. So look out for who needs help, whether that's being through a food bank. We're all experiencing price inflations through everything right now, whether that's supporting someone else that that has the capacity to house refugees. There's a lot of concerns about individuals who are housing refugees, and if they want to, if those hosts want to go on their first COVID-free summer holidays, looking out for your neighbors, looking out for your community. And if you are seeing any sort of discrimination or any sort of ill treatment of refugees in any way, be brave. And stand up in whatever way that looks like. That could be as simple as interrupting a conversation, asking what time it is, just to try to break the diffusion of the moment. Or it can be really standing up to being like, no, our church, our community is actually going to be here to help. It seems simple, maybe, but regardless, whether the Ukrainians and the communities that you might be seeing are as directly affected to it as maybe you're, hearing about in a presentation like this, everyone still has a story. And I also have to say in this, remember that there are other members of your community that have also been through war that are not from Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Whether they're from Afghanistan or from Yemen or Iraq or Syria, there's so many members of our communities have lived through the refugee experience. Ukraine is one, there will be more. So really take time to learn about what trauma looks like so that you can help love your neighbor better. And I think that's one of the most ultimate calls. I was just reading my daughter's bedtime stories and in a book that Desmond Tutu wrote for children. And it was all about the life of Jesus, and the greatest commandment is to love. Yeah. So maybe that's a decent bookend if no one else has any more questions.
I think that's excellent bookend. Thank you so much, Leah. I'm just going to throw two tiny things into the mix that have just come up in the chat. So one, Petter, thank you for reminding me. There are a range of resources on the website in relation to trauma. and the ones specifically for children and trauma are going to be put up next week. I know Petra-Ann's been working really hard on those, so thank you so much, Petra-Ann, and thank you for reminding me, I had forgotten. And also just a note from Peter at Stop the Traffic. He said on the Stop the Traffic website and the Traffic Analysis Hub, there are some really useful resources about supply chain analysis, so please do feel free to look at that if you're interested in taking that approach. Okay, so I just will say that as I said earlier, you will receive a PDF form of the presentation. Everyone who received a Zoom link for this call will receive a presentation. We have been busy planning the next webinars that are coming up in the next few weeks, and we're continuing to plan, so keep a lookout on the EFN website and on our various Facebook pages. And with that, I would like to say very big thank you to Leah, who has just been an absolute wealth of knowledge this evening. Thank you so much. And I would also really like to thank our fabulous translators, and I'm going to say their names all wrong now because I'm terribly English. So to Sophie, to Emis, to Joanna, to Slavka, to Andrea, and also to our superb tech expert, Richard, who every time we do one of these webinars just is so calm and keeps us all on track. He's like, do this now, think about this, remember that, and is just so on it. So thank you so much, everyone, because without our tech people and without our translators, we wouldn't be able to do these calls in the way that we are. So it's very, very much appreciated. And thank you all for coming and giving up your Thursday evening. And we hope to see you again soon.